Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Thomas Poggi, Director of the Yale Global Justice Program, welcoming you to today's seminar on tax justice, political lobbying, and campaign finance. Our moderator is James Henry, investigative journalist and former chief economist at McKinsey Company. And our guest is David Hillman of the Robin Hood Tax Campaign, also director of Stamp Out Poverty. Over to you, Jim.
I'm David Hillman, because the EU and in fact the UK have experimented with wealth taxes as well as stock transfer taxes. And I had invited him to talk specifically about his experience with the Robin Hood tax, which we will do shortly, because that was what started us off in this debate. But say a word, if you could, a little bit about the wealth tax in Europe and how it's fared. I know many countries have tried it.
Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me okay? Great, okay. So, look, I'm just to introduce myself, I'm David Hillman, I'm Director of Stamp Out Poverty. As Jim said, we have sort of pioneered the Robin Hood tax. And I have to say from the off that, I'm a campaigner rather than an economist. I cut my teeth in the anti-apartheid movement and then moved on to work on the campaign on landmines, banning landmines, and then moved on to this campaign to, then actually on the campaign to cancel debt in developing countries, before moving on to this campaign for fairer taxation of the financial sector. So in 2010, to mainstream the financial transaction tax, the FTT, we popularized the work by reframing it as the Robin Hood tax campaign. And this spawned something of a Robin Hood tax movement. And we did this with the help of a film. And I think, Jim, you were able to show the film.
Actually, I will try to show it if that's okay. Give me a second.
Yeah.
I like this idea about the Robin Hood bank tax. Yeah, it's a sweet little idea. That thing was before, but I don't think it will.
The audio isn't good.
Okay, if the audio is not good, then we'll cut the film, because I can talk you through it. But the reason why I wanted to show you this was that we were able to get this well-known actor, Bill Nighy. As a result, we had 1 million hits on this film, more than 1 million. This spawned a kind of movement on the Robin Hood tax. And it basically works on the basis that a tax that is as small as this, tiny tax, will raise a huge amount of revenue. But that's not the only motivation for the financial transaction tax. And I'm just going to explain. I'm going to come on to the fact that the energy that came behind popularizing this tax has seen legislation passed in France and Italy and in Spain. And so much of the work that is required is about how you frame, how you communicate, how you poll, how you frame, as Frank was saying, about fairness. These are absolutely vital ingredients that go alongside all the policy work. But the motivations of the financial transaction tax are three. There is, of course, the revenue. It's a proven way to raise substantial revenue. I'll come back to that in a second. And there is obviously the sense of fairness, that the kind of remuneration and bonuses that happen in the financial sector, that happen on Wall Street, many people think these people can afford it. So it should at one level, apart from some of the questions that you've put in about the revolving doors between finance and government, all of those factors. However, on a pure fairness level, one would imagine that most people would be behind a greater tax on Wall Street. The second motivation is stability. But it actually, going back to James Tobin, it's about throwing sand in the wheels of financial trading that benefits essentially buy and hold strategies of investment and mitigates against the get rich quick casino approach, particularly reducing the destabilizing impacts of high frequency trading. So the FTT is viewed by many, or the financial transaction tax is viewed by many economists as good for incentivizing long-term investment over the short term. And the other area particularly interesting to those people who want to fighting for tax justice is that it brings about greater transparency. Greater taxation of the sector leads to greater oversight by financial authorities, and that contributes to clamping down on tax avoidance. I am obviously giving a talk on this on the financial transaction tax here, and we can have a look at it in questions in terms of the broader progressive taxation agenda of taxing wealth, taxing particularly those that have made the most money out of the pandemic, which again will be seen as fair. But concentrating on this, it's important to understand that this sort of idea is not radical. It is really a mainstream idea. And one of the ways of showing that is its heritage and its provenance. The idea of the stamp duty and the stock transfer tax, which really comes back to the stamp duty, it predates income tax. It goes back to the 1690s. The financial transaction tax, so as I say, predates income tax. Financial transaction taxes appear in Keynes, in the general theory, and well known as an idea of James Tobin, specifically on currency, and he was a US Nobel Prize winning economist. And you sometimes hear of the financial transaction tax as the Tobin tax. And in fact, in a way, what we did was simply drop the T from Tobin and put an R in front of it. And that was one way of how we managed to popularize it. So another key reason why it isn't radical but mainstream is that it exists already in at least 40 countries, and it goes in and out. It's there for a while, then it gets stopped. It is often brought in to meet a situation of financial crisis. And to give you an example, the US has a financial transaction tax, apart from the one in New York, which we can come to. But I think Jim, you were saying recently it raises $2 billion. It's the Section 31 fees, $1 to $2 billion. Pays for the Securities and Exchange Commission.
The SEC is funded by a financial transactions tax and raises about $3.5 billion a year. The UK has a tax that raises about $6 billion.
Yeah, it raises about $5 billion. It raises 3.5 billion pounds, and it's at 0.5%. And it's been going for ages. And it was at 2%. Then it was at 1%. Now it's at 0.5%. So, there's many. I'll deal with one myth because I think that's important. Because I agree with Senator Bradley when you said that this sort of tax is a no-brainer. But you also said that you need international cooperation, and so it's something we have to bust because. You often hear it won't work because all countries need to implement FTTs at the same time, or they'll be avoided by moving trading to a country that doesn't have FTTs. But this flies completely in the face of the evidence. Many FTTs, as I said, exist. There's so many countries have them. Hong Kong, a colleague on a number of calls, in Kenya, in Tanzania, they're all over the place. And the key point is they've all been introduced unilaterally, and it's down to design. If FTTs are designed properly, then companies cannot avoid them by relocating their financial trading. That's absolutely key, and it's absolutely true. So what is the revenue potential of the FTT? Now, I'm going to give the UK as an example. The UK currently has a 0.5% tax. on the purchase of shares. At 0.5%, that raises 3.5 billion a year, about $5 billion, as we're saying. If we were to get rid of a loophole, there's a market maker exemption. If we were either to get rid of it or to give it a discounted rate, you'd get an extra billion pounds a year. If you extend it from shares to bonds and derivatives, you'd raise another 3.7 billion at a very modest rates that are not going to destroy the market. If you extended it further to foreign exchange, you would get a further 2.2 billion at modest rates. And so you would get an extra 7 billion. So we would raise from 3.5 billion pounds to over 10 billion very, very easily. Now you can imagine if you did this in the US and then all over the world, the revenue potential is tens of billions, if not more than that. At the same time as putting quite a heavy dent into the very high volume, low margin financial activity of high frequency trading, which is, as many people know, is documented as being responsible for a number of flash crashes in recent years. So look, the situation in Europe, I'll just very briefly tell you this, I'm going to keep this presentation pretty short, is that following the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and the launch of the Robin Hood tax, which happened in 2010 with a film that we couldn't show, the key thing there was that a political window of opportunity opened up. And this is pretty critical. Moments of financial crisis present us with political opportunity if we can convert them. And it is quite clear that this next 2 years is going to be very, very tough as we are trying to get ourselves out of the amount of revenue lost because of COVID. And the budget deficits that are all over the place. Notwithstanding some of the amount that can be coming from Washington, this is still a very difficult situation, and this is a political opportunity. So if we go back to where we were in 2010, say, countries in Europe at least started to get really behind the financial transaction tax, due, I have to say, to a lot of work that we had done in the preceding years. And in 2012, France introduced something very closely to the stock transfer tax. In Italy, in 2013, they did it. And in January of this year, Spain followed suit. And these are modest kind of stock transfer taxes, similar, as I said, to the one on the books in New York, which, as we've covered in this call, is currently rebated back to Wall Street. Which I think, you know, if that was generally known, if we could actually show lots of people that this tax is rebated back at the same time, this is a massive budget deficit going on in New York, I think, frankly, it would cause an outcry. So I'll leave you with this, and I'm very happy to take questions. The size of today's foreign exchange market is $5.3 trillion a day. Equivalent to a pile of $100 bills that would stretch from the surface of the moon to the surface, from the surface of the earth, sorry, to the surface of the moon. Okay, now hang in here with me on this one, because it doesn't just go from earth to the moon, it goes back to the earth again and then back to the moon again. That's how long this pile of $100 bills is. And all we are saying here at this time of economic crisis is that it's surely not too much to ask that a small slice of that enormous pile of money should go to healthcare and making the lives of ordinary folk better. And it's all about campaigning. In my opinion, it's all about campaigning. It's about communicating those kind of messages. Absolutely, it's needed, and it's needed now. Thanks for listening.
Terrific, David. Thank you. I will look to students for questions first, but Phil Steck is a representative in New York in the Assembly. He has a bill before the legislature, which has also an equivalent in the state Senate. And it's attracted 55 sponsors in a Democratic controlled assembly. The problem has been Governor Cuomo, has problems of his own these days, but he has been captive of Wall Street. Now, the actual details of the Wall Street tax, it's been on the books since 1905. It is 1 nickel per physical share. Last year, the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange did $49 trillion of trades. The average trade on the New York on the NASDAQ was $8,400, and that consisted of the average stock price of $48 times 176 shares. So the actual tax that New York State would levy on that would be 1 nickel times 176, which is $8.80. As a share of the average trade, that is 0.1% on investors. Probably the lowest most progressive sales tax you can imagine, and the easiest to collect. So we have been fighting with the New York State Department of Finance to get accurate numbers because they rely on Wall Street to tell them how much the rebate actually is. And the numbers, surprisingly, while the market volumes have been going down since 2017, have been going up through the roof. Last year was the record year for all trading on the New York Stock Exchanges. Their estimates of revenue have been going down. In 2017, the figure was $13.8 billion that was rebated. This year is something between 6 and 7. We just don't believe the numbers, and we've got the Commissioner of Taxes admitted that Wall Street firms are not reporting and there's no enforcement. So let me turn it over to Phil for a minute there and ask him to ask his question. Then we'll get questions from Radion. And
so on a lighter note, I just wanted to mention that I wore number 24 in high school basketball. I've met Clyde and I met Willis, and now I've met you, at least remotely, Senator. So thank you for bringing much joy to me in my youth. But I wanted to just make a point following up on David, which is that Hong Kong just increased its stock transfer tax from 10 cents per $100 to 13 cents per $100. And the Hong Kong market went down a little bit. So the head of Goldman Sachs equity division in Hong Kong was interviewed, and he says, oh, this means nothing in the long run. People don't make investment decisions based on 13 cents per $100. And while certainly it would be great if we had a worldwide financial transaction tax, but the point is there's no evidence that any investors have ever moved, say, from New York when we had a stock transfer tax to any other venue in the world because of a tax that is so tiny. It's just not enough to make a difference. And so that was the only point I wanted to make. I could go on about that. I mean, for example, when New York put in the tax, the New York Times editorialized against it. It's going to destroy the city. There were many other stock exchanges in the United States at that time. When I visit my daughter in Philadelphia, I walk by the old Philadelphia Bourse, which doesn't exist anymore. And all the trading moved to New York because people take advantage of the high volume and the tremendous variety of securities that you can purchase in New York. But the other stuff that I could bring to the table would probably be a discussion of New York State politics, which is beyond the scope of this discussion in a whole other world. I will say that the senator made an outstanding point about Reagan and Clinton. Our governor is a Bill Clinton disciple, right down to the triangulation. And what happened as a result of Reagan is that because of the massive defense spending increases, because of the tax cutting, infrastructure the federal dollars for infrastructure was drying up. So in New York, like many states, there was a choice. You can either raise taxes, which was against the popularity of Ronald Reagan and against the arguments of Bill Clinton, or you can let the infrastructure go to hell. So what do you think happened? They let the infrastructure go to hell to the extent that our infrastructure in New York is rated C-. We have a wonderful climate leadership bill. We're supposed to be fossil free, fuel free by 2040. It's completely unfunded. And I'll close with this. I always get this from my friends who are telling me that we have to all be moderate in our politics. And here's the question I ask. How do you address global climate change with moderation? I never get an answer.
Great point. And Enzo, you've been Radion?
Harrison had his hand up before me.
Harrison. There you go. Back.
Okay, so you're too kind. Well, I think I just have two quick questions. The first is quite simple about the projected tax revenue of these, of the Robin Hood tax. Does that assume that, what level of trading does that assume? Does it assume the same level of trading? Does it assume some decrease based on precedent or what? I mean, it's not particularly relevant. It's just a question. And then the other question is around like the strategy for implementing this on like a worldwide level, in the sense that like surely given the leadership of New York and maybe the City of London in financial trading, these are the areas that should be targeted, rather than like as much as it's great if Italy has a financial transaction tax, like who's trading stocks in Italy? I don't know if I'm like ignorant there, but what's like the strategy for getting this through in the key financial districts?
Okay, so very quickly on the first question. So the idea is not to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. So you calibrate the tax to the margins in the market, so that in fact it will have an effect. It will mainly have an effect on high frequency trading when it's really, you throw a huge amount of money in with very, very low margins using algorithms. And yes, you would see some kind of dent in the market there. But for anything that's remotely like trading in goods and services, this sort of tax will make no discernible difference at the levels that we're talking about to that activity. So, so I think that was on that. In terms of, I think it's wrong to think of it as think of a global strategy. You can think of an international. Things could be done internationally. You can think of things regionally. But as indeed with Europe, because you have 10 countries that are working to get a transaction tax, 10 member states, which include Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. And Germany and France, I think, have the largest financial markets, but Italy and Spain have the next largest financial markets, and those four countries represent 90% of Eurozone GDP. So they do have substantial markets. Depending on whether they just tax shares, the rate they tax shares, whether they tax both sides of the transaction, whether they tax intraday trading as well, there's many variations of what can be done. Let alone if they extend it to bonds, derivatives, foreign exchange, etc. The potential is really quite significant as to what revenue could be brought in. But I think in terms of strategy, I think it's wrong to try and think of it as a global thing, because that's not the way to go. That's the multilateral argument which prevents any kind of progress. It has to be done really as a series of unilateral and possibly regional steps. Who's next?
The question about elasticities, we've done, the answer to that question is we've taken a look at the impacts in other markets, and they built that in. There is some reduction in volume in response to this, but not much. So volume.
And certainly I can say this, that we may be able to make this available. The Portuguese presidency, 6-month presidency, presented a paper about a month ago, because it's aiming to try to get the agreement across these 10 countries by the end of their presidency in the end of June. And at the end of that paper, 20-page paper, it has an analysis of the French FTT of 2012 and the Italian one of 2013 as like an appendix, and it shows that there was no discernible drop in volume after introducing the tax at the rate they introduced the tax. We could probably dig that out. Jim will probably be able to get hold of that. I can send you that and make that available to you.
What is the revenue of a tax on all trades in New York?
The revenue right now,
in the U.S.
Yeah. In New York, we estimate that the revenue per year after allowing for the impact on trading would be between 12 and 15 billion a year, which would be enough to fix the deficit. If you did it,
that's just on stocks. That's just stocks.
And that's just stocks. It's not bonds. It's not derivatives. It's not currency, as the Tobin thing was meant to be. But if you simply just did the stock trading volume, the number is closer to $40 billion a year. So there's, we're allowed for the elasticity effect because of the high frequency traders. The politics of this are interesting. There's a handful of very, very high frequency trading firms in New York that make the average trade lasts 10 minutes, and it's in and out constantly. But they have enormous political clout. Some of the biggest contributors to the Democratic Party in New York are associated with these firms. So, Radion.
Who?
Renaissance Technologies, James Simon, if you want to know.
Okay.
That's one of the players. But Enzo.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Mr. Hillman. You discussed one of the myths surrounding just the idea of financial transaction taxes and how individuals and corporations respond to it. And I was just wondering, what role, if any, do financial transaction taxes and wealth taxes in general play in the growth of tax havens? And is there a possibility that more wealthy people and just corporations in general would seek to hide their wealth in offshore jurisdictions if we increase taxes? I know you've discussed this during the you debunking the myth surrounding just taxing in general. And part of the reason I'm asking this is because we know that these offshore havens, tax havens, cost governments between 500 to 600 billion a year, and that is a lot of money compared to what we're talking about in terms of what we can generate from just taxing these corporations and these individuals. So what sort of I guess ways can we come up with to curtail such tax avoidance behavior?
Okay, so will FTTs encourage a flight of money to tax havens? I really don't think so. And I think it's because of the way in which the FTTs can be designed. It's about taxing within the system. If you tax, as with the tax on stocks, and it's automated at the point of settlement, it is within the circuitry, the wiring, the plumbing of the system itself. It's code. It's as you make these transactions, you buy these shares, a proportion goes to whichever financial authority. And because it's inside of the financial system, this is why it's really disliked. Because if you tax at the end of the chain, then your pinstripe mafia can come in and can manage the tax liability and send it off to your tax havens. The automation of the financial transaction tax as part of the system makes it extremely difficult to avoid. So I mean, that's the thing I would say there. As well, it's to do with, it's a tax, especially on shares, it's a tax on ownership. So, when you pay your, whatever the rate is, you, by doing that, you end up with as beneficial owner of the shares. So the risk of not ending up as beneficial owner by not paying the tax is not a risk worth taking. That's certainly how it's organized in the UK. So that issuance principle, as we call it in taxation, is a safeguard built into the design to make sure that you wouldn't want to avoid it. And as I say, I don't think it's very technically difficult to avoid it when it's automated into the system.
Radion.
Yeah, my question is more on the campaign front. I think recently, especially with the GameStop example, we saw that there's a lot of youth willing to participate in changing the way financial markets work. So I was wondering how well, I guess, your campaigns, both in New York and abroad, are targeting, the under 30 demographic, and whether they've presented some form of participation in your attempts to pass the FTTs.
That's a good question. Certainly, the younger demographic have been involved in the past, and indeed in some of the work that we're doing at the moment to pressurize in Germany. We are particularly targeting the youth groups of the SPD. Because the finance minister is from that party, and their elections are coming up in September, and he's going to be very sensitive about those votes. So it's a good question, because that is definitely true. But I would also say that for that younger demographic, the crossover between climate and finance is incredibly important, and that they're also interested in the divestment campaign of sort of targeting financial institutions that are enabling the fossil fuel companies, and that area is something that we find the younger demographic are particularly interested in. So we look to plant the financial transaction tax as part of a general set of actions that need to happen on the financial sector itself.
I just had one remark about the question about offshore havens. It turns out wealth taxes may well be easier to exploit or in response to havens. And some people say it's depending on your billionaire, there's something like 671 billionaires in the United States, 150 in New York. If you taxed wealth in New York State, you might see some of them, like Robert Mercer, who's Renaissance Technologies former investor, has 12 houses. He would find it fairly easy to move to Kentucky or Florida. If you do the wealth taxes at a national level, it's harder, obviously, but there's a substantial number of folks who may well be able to avail themselves of offshore holding structures to avoid wealth taxes. The stock transfer tax, we think, is more difficult to avoid, and in fact, many of the traders are located outside of places like New York or even the United States today. So you're effectively collecting taxes on an international community. Bill Bradley had to leave. We didn't get a chance to thank him for his participation, but I recommend that you all get a film. If you're basketball fans, you know that this is March Madness weekend for the first time in a while. But there's a film called When the Garden Was Eden, which is about the legendary Bradley Knicks team from 1970 to 73. And it's really worth, even if you're not a basketball fan, you'll be astonished.
Did that just come out, Jim?
No, it's been out. It's an ESPN film. It's
Oh, I
available.
haven't seen that. I have to
it's
see it.
terrific.
Great.
Yeah, it's fabulous. But on that happy note, Thomas, do you want to wrap things up, or if we have any other questions or discussion, we can continue. But we just opened the door on this very complicated area of tax. I hope we have stimulated interest to some extent. There are extraordinary investigative issues and research questions that we have, you know, like why is the tax revenue in New York not being reported? You know, there's all kinds of investigative work for students who are interested in doing economic investigations here. So follow up if you're interested in that.
Right, good. Then thank you, everybody. And we had a fantastic session, and we see you all next time on Tuesday at 3:30.
Thanks very much.